Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of our Multi-Learn Nuggets on multilingual assessment. Today we will be talking about the relation between cognition and emotion in assessment situations in education contexts. By the end of this nugget, you would have learned the following 5 things. 1. The components of cognition. 2. How test anxiety as a form of emotion affects cognition. 3. How the relationship between emotion and cognition links to multilingualism. 4. The stages of assessment. And 5. How multilingual assessment addresses the negative emotions held by test-anxious students at the input, processing, and output stages of assessment. According to Antier, Valder-Michael and Dyers, test taking requires the activation of the following components of cognition. These are reasoning, judging, perception, imagining, problem solving, attention, and remembering. So, how exactly can emotion affect cognition in assessment situations? Well, imagine this. You've been up studying the night before your history exam. You've gone through all your lecture material and you feel confident that you'd achieve good results. The next day, whilst taking the test, you begin to feel slightly less confident as you're struggling to remember what you've studied. You cannot think very clearly. You don't really understand what the question is asking of you. You begin to feel sick. You're sweating and you feel dizzy, and this makes you really nervous. You just know you're going to fail the assessment. If this has ever happened to you, you may have experienced test anxiety. Test or assessment anxiety is a form of emotion that may have physiological or psychological effects. This diagram shows some consequences of test anxiety that may be experienced by students when doing assessments. Students may be unable to analyze, unable to critique, unable to understand the question or to think deeply. They may be unable to solve problems or to focus or to recall information stored in memory. Notice that many of these consequences have to do with the different aspects of cognition. In the following table, which consequence of test anxiety would you match with what aspect of cognition? Look, I've already matched one for you. Feel free to pause the video to complete the rest of the table. Now that we see how emotion in the form of test anxiety can affect cognition, the question is, what's multilingualism got to do with it? So far, it has been mainly theory. Let's now draw on some concrete data to answer our 2 questions. That is, 1. How emotion affects people's cognition in assessment situations, and 2. How multilingualism somehow determines how emotion affects people's cognition in assessment situations. This case study comes from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, where the authors of this article have been teaching and assessing a particular course multilingually. They've also been researching the effects of the approach. To understand their findings, it is important to understand how they model the stages of an assessment. At the input stage, students apply attention or initial processing of questions and instructions to understand what is required. This understanding is passed on to the processing stage, where students are required to recall, reason, or solve problems in response to the input. And finally, the output stage involves the students' demonstration of the answers and is a culmination of the previous processes. Literature on emotion and its influence on cognition claims that at the input stage, test-anxious students experience difficulty in comprehending relatively simple instructions. A comment made by a student from the case study supported this, stating that understanding the instruction in English was challenging. The student said, "I found that in most cases in my other modules, I had to reread an assignment question or ask people to explain it further to me or to translate it for me. Some English words are not entirely or fully easy for me to interpret and understand. This has caused a lot of confusion for me at times, and it has even made me quite frustrated and worried about how my marks will turn out to be." When the assessment was delivered multilingually, a student stated the following: "I have found it useful to have some of the test questions translated into isiXhosa. To see the questions in isiXhosa lessen the levels of anxiety I have as any other student before and during the test. I was less anxious because I was able to read the question both in English and isiXhosa." Here we see how emotions influence cognition. When assessed monolingually, the students struggled to comprehend instructions at the input stage. However, when delivering the assessment multilingually, this challenge seemed to be addressed. At the processing stage, literature suggests that test-anxious individuals focus on shallow or physical features rather than deep semantic features of stimuli. When a multilingual arrangement was implemented, a student stated the following: "What also made me happy was the fact that I had more time to interpret things carefully, because the fact that I naturally think in isiXhosa was accompanied by isiXhosa notes. This made me understand concepts clearer without the hassle of translating my isiXhosa thoughts to English." Here we see that, in a sense, providing the student with material in both English and isiXhosa address some of the anxiety that leads to surface level processing in the processing stage of assessment. Finally, literature suggests the following for test-anxious students in the output stage of assessment. Academic material may be acquired and understood, but then can be lost and become inaccessible in a variety of performance situations, including homework problem solving, reciting the answer before the class, writing an essay, giving an oral report, taking essay exam, and the like. When students had the opportunity to respond multilingually, a student stated the following: "The term test that we wrote on LCS 311, instructions were given in Afrikaans and isiXhosa. That made it easy for students, including myself, to understand the question. I was also given a chance to respond using any language for the test. I must say it was great exercise. On this module, I was permitted to engage in translanguaging, and that has enhanced my performance. I used isiXhosa and English to respond to questions, and I obtained more than 70% on the term test. I am one of the Black South African who has a poor English proficiency. Therefore, these arrangements have boosted my confidence and my academic performance." From the student's experience, it appears that in demonstrating knowledge, the students' answers were enhanced when the multilingual option was made available, and it took care of the anxiety that makes people forget. From the responses of the students, we see that emotion may indeed affect the cognition of an individual during assessment situations. Drawing from the responses, multilingual language arrangements deemed to have positive outcomes for students, as they reported having understood instructions more clearly, had the ability to recall information more effectively, and activate a deeper level of information processing, and more importantly, had more confidence in the responses within content assessments without the concern of language or grammar as being the focus. Now let's test your knowledge. For each of the questions below, say out your answers in no more than 30 seconds. Alternatively, feel free to pause the video here so you can answer. Congratulations on your awesome performance! You did great! That's all we have for this nugget. I hope you've learned a lot and found this information helpful.
Created using Powtoon.